We're recording now. Welcome to another webinar tonight, you guys. We're first meeting with Edward Winkleman, who has a gallery. I love that word, eponymous. That means named after yourself in New York City. And I think Ed is exemplary of what I hope is a new breed of dealers in terms of greater accessibility and expressing himself on the internet with a really fabulous blog, edwardwinkleman.com. I think that's right, and if it's not, it'll correct us in a moment. And, you know, I think it's not usual that dealers express themselves and take stances and have a point of view and an opinion. I think the norm is that they feel like they might be antagonizing some of their public or their audience if they do that. And he does, you know, so that he puts himself out there, I think is excellent. And he says a lot of interesting things, which is how I got to know him in the first place, which is not to say that we've ever met. I think he's read some of the things that I've written, and I've read quite a few of the things that he's written. And I really respect his point of view. And, you know, we've met with a couple of art dealers in Chicago. We met with another art dealer, Katie Rashid, Andrea Rosen Gallery in New York, and now we're meeting with Ed. And Ed, I think, you know, some of what's enlightened this group is the reality that, you know, I mean, all the artists feel like they have an incredible passion about what they do. And I think they're sometimes surprised to realize that collectors and dealers, you know, share a similar passion. I think some of the time, you know, people assume that they're just in it for the business or their antithetical interests. I would love it if you could, you know, introduce yourself a little bit, talk about, I don't know, I always loved hearing where people went to high school because somehow it gives me some kind of perspective on the whole situation. And then, you know, briefly wonder, you know, how you got from, you know, that point to where you are today, and how long you've had a gallery, and what that meant to you. And also, before I do that, the rest of you guys, Ed seemed to think that he likes to go off and tell long stories, which I kind of like, but he preferred that we have questions and a dialogue. So be prepared after he speaks for a few minutes to fire up some questions by either raising your hands or texting your interest and asking a question to me, and we'll take it from there. Ed, it's all yours now. Go right ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Excellent. You know, the other people are all muted except for me right now, so that they won't be able to interrupt. If I unmute too many people, we end up having a lot of echo. So know that we can all hear you, and go right ahead.
Well, can I ask that Ed turn his mic up, because when you come on, you boom if he is not as loud as you.
And I'll try and talk more quietly because I do it. You know, I talk really loudly. So Ed, I don't know if you can turn it up or not, but I'll talk more quietly. Okay, Ed.
Okay. I'll try and speak more loudly. But thank you, everyone. It's actually fascinating to sit here and look at everyone's faces. So, Paul, thank you very much for inviting me to participate.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
I'm going to keep kind of scrolling through and seeing everyone's faces. But you had asked a little bit about how I got started with the gallery, so I'll talk briefly about that. My background includes being an amateur painter, which I loved doing, but realized at a certain point I was nowhere near as good at as the other people whose studios I was going into, and that I enjoyed much more talking to other artists about what they were doing than I did spending time in the studio myself. And I lived for a while in Washington, D.C., where I met an art dealer who seemed happier at what she was doing than anybody else had ever met in my life. She was so enthusiastic about talking about art, selling art to her clients. And I thought, well, why don't I try that for a while and see if I feel the same way that she did. And in fact, I did end up loving being on this side of the sort of artist gallery fence, if I will. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about why there seems to be a fence there. But in short, I realized I'm a better advocate for talking about why I think art is important than I ever was a painter of myself. So we started the gallery that I currently have in 2001 in Williamsburg, and perhaps if there's a reason why I identify more with artists than most people think galleries do. It's because my business partner was an artist when we started Plus Ultra Gallery in Williamsburg. And almost every single gallery that started in the Williamsburg district of Brooklyn at the time had at least one owner who was an artist. So it was
I think you should explain that Williamsburg is Brooklyn for people who don't necessarily know the geography. Oh, I just did.
That'll work. Yeah, Williamsburg is one of the districts of Brooklyn, and in the late 1990s, it exploded as a scene of contemporary galleries. A lot of why that happened was there was concentration. In fact, I think Williamsburg is recognized as having the highest concentration of artists per capita of any neighborhood in the world. So there was a club of galleries in Soho and 57th Street in New York, and a lot of the artists who were there in Brooklyn felt that they couldn't break into that system. So Williamsburg said, forget that, we'll start showing our own artists here. And our gallery was one of the galleries that was part of that scene. And because my business partner at the time was an artist, all of my friends were artists, and all the gallerists that I was talking to originally were also artists. We built the program from an artist-centric point of view. So that being said, I don't know a single dealer who couldn't make more money in some other field, given the talents that they have. So very few, if anybody, goes into the art selling business to make money. They go into it because they have an affinity with or a passion for art. I forgot which other questions were, Paul. Sorry.
Where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Washington, D.C.?
No, I grew up in Ohio. Went to school in Youngstown, Ohio, very tough steelworker town. And as soon as I graduated from college there with a degree in communications rather than art, I took some art classes, but my degree was in communications. I left, went and lived in Europe for 3 years. I traveled. I lived in London for a while, France for a while, Portugal, Italy, etc. Traveled to a bunch of other countries. Came back, landed in D.C., and my first career was in publishing. I wasn't very happy in publishing, and I realized when I met this art dealer in D.C. that it was something I could do I'd be much more passionate about. And I think there is, if you look at a lot of the art dealers throughout history who have managed to do something significant as an art dealer, very few of them were actually art historians or came from a art background. A lot of them came from business or something else. I mean, if you look at Leo Castelli, if you look at, well,
I was going back to Joe Devine, Joseph Devine, and then wondering about Bernard Berenson, who has done, dealers have affiliated themselves with scholars, I think, more than having been scholars, though some are.
Well, it's funny you should mention Devine and Berenson because that has become a brand new model. It's not a new model, but it's a number of the galleries that I know who were struggling in the early 2000s, who have made significant leaps forward, did it specifically by teaming up with smart curators, or art historians. So
we should talk about that. Let's come back to that in a moment or two. When you began in Brooklyn, were most of the artists that you worked with there from the community?
Originally, yes. Yes. It was a very Brooklyn sort of scene.
And how long did you remain in Brooklyn?
We were there from 2001 to 2006, and in 2006 we moved into Chelsea.
There's a lot of galleries. I guess I'm reluctant to use the word graduate, but there's a fair number of galleries that moved from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and then there's a number that have stayed behind. Like Pierogi, and I think we'll have a vibrant program there. How has your business and your perspective changed from Brooklyn to Manhattan?
Well, moving into Manhattan, all of our expenses went up.
Definitely.
Significantly. it's amazing how many people out there think that a gallery is a place they should be making money from. And I'm not talking about artists, I'm talking about other businesses. But the reason a lot of us left Brooklyn and moved into Manhattan was the traffic in Brooklyn wasn't significant. You had some really smart people start galleries there, and unfortunately a few of them have gone out of business. But some of my favorite galleries of all time, including Bellwether and Roebling Hall, started in Brooklyn and moved into the city, predominantly because two things. People had a hard time getting out to Brooklyn, and for a while the L train, which was the lifeline out to the Williamsburg section, was constantly under repair. And so a lot of us ended up just getting frustrated with that. But second, you would get your artist to a certain point, and they would feel if they didn't make the leap into Manhattan, that they would have to leave the gallery. An artist of mine said that to me. You know, you're doing very well, you're selling almost everything, but I feel for me to make the next step in my career, I need to be in Manhattan. And so with enough of our artists feeling that way, we just couldn't remain in Brooklyn. We had to move into the city. So,
how did your program change when you moved?
It had started to evolve a little bit before we moved, but when you're in Manhattan, you realize that, well, it actually coincided with a stark realization across the whole industry that you needed to be a global player, that to compete in what was an increasingly global market, you needed artists from various parts of the world. So we started adding artists from various parts of the world, started adding artists that would appeal not only to New York collectors, but to European collectors, to Asian collectors, South American collectors, etc.
Excuse me, can you quantify your program? Do you feel like the gallery has a particular focus or, you know, certain parameters that you try and stay within?
When I think about what the artists we work with share, I come to two central ideas. One, a lot of the artists we work with have a practice that involves a significant amount of research, and research in sociological sort of fields. Then they come back into the studio, they process that research through you know, their studio practice and decide which media to work in to produce the work that they're going to. So we have that sort of side to it. The other side of it is art about art or art about art history, which I get a lot of flack for in certain quarters, but actually is something that I simply enjoy. So, but so those two veins would be what most of the artists I'm working with are mining.
Okay. Does it break down into any specific price range, or do you try to have a lot of, you know, different price points? And you know, do you try and have a balance between male and female, or does that not relevant, or, you know, some of those kinds of things?
Well, that's a really good question about male versus female. One of the artists that I work with is Jennifer Dalton, and Jennifer Dalton is an artist who makes a lot of work about disparity in the art world. And if I would ever ignore that issue, Jennifer would remind me very quickly. So I'm conscious of the breakdown, but it doesn't inform decisions on an artist-by-artist basis. And if you talk to Jennifer about what she thinks the art world should do about disparity between men and female, or men and women artists, she would say simply be conscious of it. She wouldn't say that you should definitely bring in one more woman artist because you're one woman artist shy of having a 50-50 split. Her central message is that the disparity will fade away if people simply remain conscious that it exists. So, and then we break down by medium. We have a probably slightly higher focus on video than a lot of galleries, and I think we have a slightly lower number of painters than a lot of galleries. And if you know anything about those two markets, you know painting sells a lot better than video. So we're not particularly, we're not raking it in, so to speak, because of that. But it just happens to be the way that the artists that I'm interested in working with kind of are leaning toward media-wise.
Is it important, I'm going to ask some loaded questions, or at least I got one. Is it important to you that the gallery show a profit?
My accountant would say no.
That it's not important to you or not important to him or her?
Well, my accountant would, by showing me the numbers, say, no, it's not important to you.
Yeah.
What's important to me, and I've taken a very sort of tortoise versus the hare approach to the gallery. What's important to me is that I'm engaged and that I'm continuously learning. We have a main gallery, and then we also have a curatorial research lab, which is a project space that we give over to curators, and they're completely given carte blanche to do whatever it is they would like to do in that space. And what I get out of that is a constant education. These are curators who bring in sort of new ideas about curating and are allowed to do whatever it is they want. So that goes back to what is important to me, is that I'm learning. I will say something that I've never said on my blog or anything before, which is I don't rely on the gallery for my own income, but the gallery does need to pay for itself. So it is important to me that it does pay for itself. I can't lose money on it, but I don't need to live off it either. So.
Let's talk about education. I think it's important that artists know, are decently versed in their antecedents, and that if someone says to an artist, your work looks a lot like Robert Rauschenberg, they're not supposed to go, boo. And you mentioned that you did not major, I don't know, you said you mentioned in communication, majored in communication, and I don't know to what extent you took art history classes in college, and I'm not even necessarily sure how much art history classes in college teach you much about, the world that you are involved in. How did you become art historically knowledgeable, or are you first?
Well, I'm certainly not an art historian, but I did take classes in college. I did take studio classes when I got out of college, and I interned at a gallery that dealt with 20th century modernist and contemporary art, and sort of apprenticed there. So my education was cobbled together from those three sources. So I consider myself fairly knowledgeable. I do find gaps every now and then, but it's
nice to find those gaps, isn't it? I think, because all of a sudden you can go, oh my goodness, there's something I need to look into, and it's kind of a revelation.
And as I said before, that for me is the most important part of this whole process, is that I keep learning. So yeah, those gaps are great.
I found when I had a gallery that I learned a lot from artist titles, and that there were historical references and or even just poetry. I mean, one of my favorite artists had, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. And I still remember that title, and I had never heard that saying before. And, I referred to a work of her art, Christine Bourdet, and I really, loved that. It's, emblematic of the different kinds of things that I learned from artists. I think artists are just really, a wealth of information. Do you have a pretty hands-on relationship with all the artists you work with?
I do, and it's funny you should say that you enjoyed learning from that artist. The best part of this whole job for me is being in the studio, doing a studio visit with the artist, where I'm challenged on what I think sort of is important, or what I'm thinking even those artists who I know well are doing. I'm sorry, could you phrase that question one more time, Paul? Sorry.
How often do you speak to your artists, each of them?
Well, I don't call them daily, I'm very online oriented, so we email much more frequently than we do, but I'll probably touch base with every one of them depending on what's going on. If they have museum shows or gallery shows, it's much more frequent, but otherwise about once a month or so.
And Do you feel like it's part of your role to find artists exposure in other venues, be it other galleries or other museums, or museums?
I think it's part of my role to make that easy. I don't know that I consider it my responsibility with other galleries per se. I mean, when the right fit is obvious, then we work to make that happen. I do work to help my artists make connections with museums. So, but with other galleries, and I don't know anybody else will say this, the truth of the matter is there's competition. I mean, you know, it's at a certain point, I want my artists' careers to be successful, and yet I'm selfish. I want the very best of what they're creating for me. I want to show the very best. So the way that we try and work that out, I encourage my artists to find other galleries, and I work really well with other galleries. I tend to not act as a primary gallery even though we're in New York, meaning that after the first exhibition one of my artists has with another gallery, I just completely wash my hands of that relationship. We don't continue to sort of operate as a primary gallery for the artist in that situation. But I don't see that it's my job to get them another gallery per se.
How many artists do you represent?
18.
How many artists do you exhibit annually that you don't represent?
Probably not that many. Not as many as I used to.
Is that would that be in group exhibits, or might somebody you don't represent have a one-person exhibit or two?
Very rarely does somebody we don't represent have a one-person exhibition. We do group exhibitions, and that lately has been falling more under the project space than anything else. And that number ranges, I'd say, about 12 to 24 a year.
What is the age range of the artists you represent and or work with?
The ones I represent range from 29 to 60. And the ones we work with, the oldest artist we've ever worked with was about 76, and the youngest, I think, was maybe like 23.
You know, some of these people are, not to say getting started in art, but getting immersed in art and seeking, you know, exposure, etc. You know, maybe post-40, post-35, something like that, having done other careers and or made money and or returning to this, you know, an art school love that wasn't sufficiently pragmatic earlier. Do you think it's significant? I mean, do you think it's possible to have a career where your serious art making begins after 35 or 40?
I certainly think it's possible to have an important career within the art market well after 35 or 40. We have an artist we're working with right now, Leslie Thornton, who I think is in her late 50s and had her first solo show in a gallery with us in January. So, and it wasn't anything other than her work being the perfect match for our gallery and her work being something that I thought there would be a market for that led to that. But
how did you and she find each other?
She had been curated into a group show in our gallery.
How do you find, how much attrition is there and how many new artists are added on an annual basis, do you think?
In the last year, we added 3 new artists. And that's where we rose from like 15 to 18. I'd say I haven't actually stopped working with any artists for about 4 years, maybe 5 years. So I tend to just grow and grow and grow. I've actually only had one sort of period at which I let some artists go. And I did that all in one fell swoop. And that was when I bought out my previous business partner. After then, we just kind of continued to grow. So most galleries, I'd say, try not to have too much turnover. It's really important to the people you're selling the art to that there's some continuity there. So I'd say, you know, I would give an artist at least 3 solo shows before I decide, but it just wasn't the right fit, which is generally what we do.
How pragmatic is that? I mean, do you test somebody out in the office and hang their work there and see how it sells before you give them a group, one person and/or a group show, or is it pretty much up to your, for lack of a better word, whim?
Not so much my whim. Usually there'll be some testing ground, whether it be a group show, the back office, an art fair, something like that. And
do you try out artists at art fairs that you haven't shown much at the gallery?
Not as much as we did in the early days. When we first started working and going to the art fairs in the early 2000s, the art fairs were exploding. We did the first NADA art fair in Miami, the second NADA art fair in Miami, ARCO, and a few others like that in the early days. And first of all, nobody knew us, so it's not as if they knew what our program was. And we did test out some artists in that context. Slowly, we began to learn that that really wasn't fair to the artists or to the collectors, though, so we pulled back. It's not fair to the collectors because they assume when they see work and are buying work from you at an art fair that there's representation behind that. So we started only bringing artists to art fairs who we were representing.
If you have a stable of about 18 artists, is the assumption that most artists get an exhibit once every 24 months?
Yeah, every 24 to 36.
And I would surmise that that's not sufficient for them to have a sufficient income on that number of exhibitions to survive. Do you agree, or do they?
No, I would totally agree. And this is, again, coming back to your question about the need for artists to have more than one gallery. Several of our artists have multiple galleries, and we don't discourage that in any way. As I said earlier, we certainly work really well with other galleries, and our business model is such that it encourages galleries to begin representing our artists if they put them in a solo show. There's all the incentives for them, financial incentives for them to take that artist on. So I would totally agree that it's not feasible for most of our artists to live off their art through sales through our gallery alone.
How many, I don't know that I could ever answer this question, but I could guess. What percentage of an artist's income from your gallery happens during, how much art do you sell by artists not during exhibits and not during art fairs? Or maybe, let's see, art fairs are big.
Probably more. I'd say at this point, 60% of our sales are happening through art fairs.
60%.
No, actually, that's probably more of a boom time percentage. It's probably less than that now. The art market has slowed down, and so the exhibitions we used to have where the bulk of the sales would happen in the show or sort of shortly after has slowed down. We're doing a lot more sales in between exhibitions and even in between art fairs. So I would say the bulk of what we're selling is happening outside of either fairs or solo exhibitions.
Interesting. Okay.
That's a big change from earlier. It really is.
You think most of it was during exhibitions previously?
Yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is, in the 2004 to 2006 or 7 period, you would take work down to an art fair and sell out the booth once or even twice. And that was the bulk of the sales for a lot of galleries.
Right. I don't know if you've been around long enough to really have a perspective. How do you think the internet has changed your business, or how it affects galleries?
I have some ideas about how the internet has changed the art world for artists, and some ideas because when I used to work in a gallery in Washington, D.C., they didn't even have a website of how it's worked for galleries. For artists, it has sped up the networking process. And networking is, in my belief, the single most important use of time that an artist who's trying to get a career off the ground can spend time doing. We bring artists into our program almost 85% through networking from the artists or curators that we already work with. And so... say
that again, would you please?
I think that the internet has accelerated the rate at which artists can network, in which they can make connections with artists, other artists, or curators who have sort of a relationship with the galleries that they'd like to work with.
Are there situations where artists contact you via email and end up having, you know, where you take an interest and exhibit a work or them?
There have been situations like that. That's probably less than 10% of the current group of artists that we work with. So.
Do you get a lot of emails because of your blog?
I do. I get a lot of, even though I have gone to great lengths on my blog to explain what I think is the best way to approach a gallery, I'll still get a lot of emails from artists who didn't follow that advice.
How many readers do you think you have there?
My hit count is, it ranges between about 700 to 1,200 a day.
It's a lot. And you blog almost, well, you blog often. It's not every day, but damn close.
Yeah, usually 5 times a week.
And I'm impressed because you always have something interesting to say, whereas I think a lot of people have this responsibility to blog. Sometimes it gets, you know, fairly vacuous. For those who haven't read about, you know, the preferred way for an artist to contact your gallery, in a nutshell, what do you recommend?
On the right-hand side of my blog, near the bottom, is
Time out. Give the URL for everybody who's taking notes.
Oh, beg your pardon. So my blog is edwardwinkleman.com. It's WINKLEMAN.com. And on the right-hand side is a blog roll, and it has a lot of links. I think some of them are actually, by this point, broken. But at the bottom of the blog roll is a link to advice to artists seeking gallery representation, and it's a series of posts that I work through with artists, ranging from getting your foot in the door to tailoring your resume to galleries to how to actually approach a gallery once you're confident that that gallery's program is a good match for your work.
Take a look at that, you guys. Do you have contracts with most of your artists? Written contracts?
No, we don't believe in representation contracts. We use consignment agreements. And what that is used for is when an artist brings work into our inventory, we jot down what all the details are and make sure they understand what the terms of the consignment are. But I don't believe in a representation contract. I've seen it go sour far more times than I've seen it work well for the artist. I haven't actually even seen it work that well for galleries. I think at a certain price point, it's smart to have a representation contract when you're at the Gagosian or Matthew Marks level and you're talking about $100,000, $1 million sales. Then you should probably have everything really finely tunedly written out by lawyers. But our general sense, and maybe I should explain what I think are the differences between a representation contract and a consignment agreement. The consignment agreement covers very specific pieces of artwork and says that the gallery is trying to sell them, it's trying to sell them for this amount, and when it does sell them, these are the terms at which the artist will receive this percentage within this time frame, that the work is insured, et cetera, et cetera. A representation contract is generally the exclusive rights of the gallery to represent this artist's work within this geographical area for this period of time. And that more or less compels the artist to not have representation outside of that contract. And even though I say that I don't think it's my job necessarily to get my artists representation in other galleries, I don't want to do anything to stand in their way of that. And so I don't believe in representation contracts.
I would say that what you've just expressed is the norm. Do you agree?
It's certainly the norm among younger galleries, yes.
Yeah. And how do you know, some of these questions I'm firing at you, people have been typing to me as we chat. So, I mean,
sure.
Others of you who aren't doing that, I mean, we can open up a dialogue any moment. excuse me, but if you want to ask questions, you know, by typing, that's okay too. Eric asked about how, with the downturn in the economy and the downturn that you described in the art market, how has that changed your and the gallery strategy?
It changed it in a few ways. One, we cut back on a whole bunch of nice-to-haves. We didn't splurge on after parties. We cut back on what production costs we could cover, et cetera, et cetera. Two, we did very specifically strategize on what type of work our artists were making we thought made more sense to bring. So it wasn't, we shifted from promoting our program to trying to make sure in each exhibition we were at least standing a pretty good chance of covering costs. Now, I don't think that necessarily lowered the quality of the program. In fact, we've gotten far more New York Times reviews since the recession than we were getting before. And that's a pretty good measure in New York of how well you're doing programmatically. We also launched a few initiatives that were designed to deal directly with what the recession meant in terms of what the market wanted. We launched a publishing company called Compound Editions, and the idea there was that people will still buy art, but they may not buy it at the same price point, so let's produce multiples at a lower price point. The artist is doing the work one time, but
are those predominantly videos, or are you talking, you know, limited edition prints?
They were a combination. Some were actually handcrafted multiples. Some were prints. Some were video. But across the board, the idea was it was a piece by an artist that you already know and like, but at a price point that was a no-brainer. And it didn't make anybody a lot of money, but it kept cash flow in the artist studio. It kept cash flow in the gallery.
Do you have an opinion about the abomination called glisse? What are those damn things? Glisse prints? You know what I'm talking about?
I don't have an opinion that I'll share online, no.
Does it resemble mine? Do you sell those?
No.
Fair enough.
All the editions and multiples we sold were of traditional multiple media.
That we could call original art in one way or another, as opposed to reproductions.
As opposed to posters, yes.
Very true. How many of your artists are from further than a couple of 100 miles away from the gallery?
Probably 25%.
Whose responsibility is it to pay for shipping?
It is a case-by-case basis. So it's not set in stone. We will pay for shipping where there's no easier way to do it the other way. I would say, how do I want to say this? We try to save as much money on shipping as we can, and so we'll bargain, barter. But it is not an ironclad case that the gallery is responsible, or certainly when we take work on consignment from other galleries, then we're responsible. That's the only way the gallery would consign the work to us. But with our own artists, we try to cash in favors, anything else we can to avoid just nailing it down and saying the gallery is going to pay for this art handler to arrive at your studio and wrap this work and bring it back. That really can eat into what it is we can do in terms of realizing a vision for a show.
Are the vast majority of your artists within 5 years of your own age?
No. I'd say most of my artists are either 15 or more years younger or 15 or more years older.
That's interesting.
There's only a couple are my age, actually.
How old are you?
I'm 47.
How about your collector base? Are they within 5 years of your age, or are they distributed also?
Most of my collectors are within 5 years of me, under or significantly older.
What percentage of your collectors don't pay in full at the time they acquire the artwork?
Oh, now we're getting into the good questions now. What percentage? Actually, we're really lucky. Most of our collectors pay pretty much straight away. And my philosophy on collectors has always been to go for the addicts, the people who buy art on a regular basis, the people who know the importance of contemporary art, the importance of their collection to them. We don't sell a lot to designers or decorators or anything like that. It's not the kind of art we sell anyway. But we very much seek out and cater to the collectors who are addicted to buying art.
Does that mean you don't work with very many art consultants?
We don't really know.
And do you make some museum sales?
We make some. We're starting to make more. Museums, as everybody knows, can more or less name their price, but that ends up paying off for everybody concerned. So,
what percent of your artists work in 3D, sculptors, etc.?
Probably 65%.
Is that including video?
No, but it does include installation.
Okay. Do you find installations harder to sell?
Nearly impossible.
Yeah. But some of these things aren't quite altruistic. I mean, they garner attention. I mean, how much is social media, for example? I mean, it's sort of self-sacrificing and a burden, I feel, with my art letter periodically, but, it generates for me a lot of credibility. Beyond credibility, do you think it expands your audience and thereby the gallery success?
I don't actually think anything I do is altruistic at all. The blog is a marketing tool for the gallery. Any of the social media I do, at the very least, entertains me. So,
do you think most of your readers in the blog are artists?
Yes, I'd say based on conversations I have, probably 65% of my readers are artists, maybe 70%.
In terms of, commissions and splits with artists on sales, is it mostly 50-50?
Yes. We've had a few artists we've worked with who, and this is, I've done a lot of thinking about this and talked to a lot of other galleries about the 50-50 split. I know that's one of the points at which it begins to feel to artists that the system is unfair.
Okay, exactly.
And I've actually given lectures and done some blog posts about the situation. The long and short of it is a gallery, well, my gallery, I'll just tell you, a solo exhibition of my gallery costs between $15,000 to $18,000 to present. And that means until we have sold $30,000 to $36,000 worth of that artist's work, we're taking a loss. We are investing in that artist. And I feel until we reach the point at which we're selling enough of the artist's work to cover those costs, the 50-50 split is simply fair, meaning we're shelling out that much money, we're losing some money, and we're investing in the future of that artist. At that point, to define the relationship as a partnership and to say that, we're going to take each of these sales that comes in and split it equally, knowing that the gallery still isn't even recouping its own costs, I think that's fair. In the situations where I have given an artist 60% or more than 60%, it's where it's clear that the artist is bringing in more money than it's costing us to produce that show. And so I think that is the point at which it's fair for any artist to go to the gallery and say, look, you are making money off me. It's not an equal partnership. I believe I deserve more than 50%. And I've done that. I just think that until the gallery is clearly making more money than it's costing them to produce that show, a 50-50 split is fair.
Okay. When I had a gallery, there were certain artists or certain artwork that I felt took collectors a year before they got what I call the gimmies. You know, and frequently with good art or challenging art, I think it takes some time to understand that artist's vocabulary and the range of their expression. What kind of I mean, do you build or grow or educate collectors before they actually, you know, convert to the cash register ringing?
Certainly. It can take me years to place a certain artist's work in a collection. There are only a handful of collectors at this point who I think will buy whatever it is that I exhibit because they believe in the program. But my ultimate goal is to have more than a handful, to have several handfuls of those types of collectors. And I think that if you talk to galleries, they'll tell you all you really need to run a successful gallery are 10 collectors who will buy everything you show. At that point, you're set. But yes, we work with a number of artists whose work is challenging or impossible to sell, more or less. And at a certain point, I do relish when I can convince a collector to support this artist's project, even though they may not necessarily fully understand what it is they're doing.
How do you decide how big a discount a collector gets or whether they get one?
Well, 10% is universally understood in the art market to be anybody's for the asking, unless there's a waiting list for that artist's work. After that, the most we give anybody is 20%, and we inch our way up from 10% to 20% based on how much they support that artist and the gallery. So there are certain collectors of ours who I will give 20% on anything they buy, but that's because they consistently buy from multiple shows.
My experience was that I would give collectors time, you know, maybe even over a year to pay for something, and or a discount, but not very often both. Do you concur?
Yeah, that's a really good practice. I would say, have maybe 4% of the collectors who will require or ask for payment plans. We offer them, but most of the time, 4% of our...
Do you have some annoying collectors like I used to who preferred negotiating than acquiring?
Well, you have to remember that a lot of collectors got to the point where they could afford to buy art because they were captains of industry. They are achievers in some other financial and or business field. And negotiating to them is simply part of who they are. For other collectors, it's a sign of respect. If they can't get you to agree to a discount, they'll walk away from artwork because they're not respecting them. And I think for others, it's part of the fun, to be quite honest.
Yeah, but it can be annoying from the dealer's point of view. Or from mine it was.
Unquestionably, it's annoying, yes.
Oh, I know. I mean, I have a guy who go for 3 hours and then he'd go, well, can I pay for it over a couple of months? Like, oh, God. Do you collect yourself?
Yes, I do.
Do you collect mostly from your own gallery, or do you collect from other places also?
Well, before I opened the gallery, I bought a lot of work from other galleries. I bought a lot from Pierogi and other Williamsburg galleries, as well as I was for a while buying some significant works on paper by 20th century artists. But lately, I'd say my partner Murat and I will buy 80% from our own artists and 20% from other people's artists.
Do you buy at auction? Do you sell at auction?
Not as much. No, we're still in the emerging realm, and a few of our artists have had work come up at auction. It doesn't really sit well with me. I don't think they're ready for it yet. I'm not really pleased when that happens.
That can be challenging. Do you feel like you have to defend them when that work comes up at auction?
I feel as if, well, again, because we're working in the emerging realm, it can wreak havoc.
Certainly.
With what we and their other galleries are trying to do with their pricing and keeping it consistent and making sure that every step of the way that the people buying it can be assured that that the prices are right. So
does that mean you have to take a position on it and try and get somebody or you buy it at auction if it doesn't get to a level that you're comfortable with?
I haven't had to do that just yet. It's so tempting. I understand why galleries do it. So, but I haven't actually done it myself. So what about you? Did you ever feel the pressure to do that?
I felt pressure, and frequently I felt like I couldn't do it, and it felt like I was being compromised. And I think that there's a certain world, at auction level that, there's certain kinds of artists that play well at auction, and there are others equally fabulous artists who don't. I frequently found it a compromise, and, there were plenty of times when I would buy work by people who I respected that I didn't represent at auction, and or if things didn't sell, if they got bought in at auction, I'd call up the auction house and frequently buy things after the fact, sometimes below the reserve.
Yeah. Well, even the situation you were talking about earlier, where it takes a year or so to walk a collector through the challenging work, it's impossible to imagine that that same artist would do well at auction. If it takes that much time and not much discussion about why somebody's work is important, and you throw it up at auction, I mean, obviously by the point that most artists get to auction, they have some sort of museum record anyway. But yeah, there are definitely artists who don't do as well at auction. And then you have the whole situation where you have to go back and explain to the other collectors who have purchased the work why it didn't do well at auction. You have to talk the artist off a ledge, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think that, well, the auction houses the business of the auction houses is to make art expensive. The business of the galleries is to tell and explain to collectors why art is important. And those two things are not in harmony.
What about resale? And I mean, some of the artists that you've sold, their work comes, somebody moves, they tire of it, they want to trade it in. Do you engage in resale of the artist's works, the artists you represent?
We do, yeah. We encourage our collectors to bring the work back to us. Yeah.
What happens when they bring you back work of an artist you no longer represent?
I still have a network of people interested in that work generally, so I still try and place it. I've done that. I've placed work by artists that I no longer represent.
You would prefer that they give it back to you. You're probably not buying much of that outright. It's usually taking it on consignment.
Exactly, and usually it happens pretty quickly or not at all.
And that's usually in the 20 to 25% commission for yourself?
No, I wish I were getting that much.
I usually do. What did you get from these things?
It depends.
But frequently less.
Frequently less, because usually the person bringing it back to me is still one of my clients, and I'm doing it to them as a favor.
But to an extent that competes against your ability to sell an existing work consigned to you directly from the artist, where you're making more money then.
Exactly, and so you weigh that against the importance of that collector to you.
I think as a dealer, there's quite a few things that one feels as their moral responsibility, to do justice to the artist and to do justice to their oeuvre. And some of those things are not financially reconcilable, but you're compelled to do it anyway. And maybe you try to moderate it, but nevertheless, you do that.
No, I would agree with that fully. There's a lot that we do in our program that is not about making sales. It's about believing in the artist and doing what we think is right for their careers, or just loving what it is that they're doing and saying, well, we'll take a loss on this show because we want this to be out there.
Where do your jollies come from? I mean, like, what is the most satisfying part of doing what you do?
Oh, I'm so...
I never could answer that. I could never figure out why I did it. I mean, for me, it was a belief structure. But, what's it for you?
Well, there's two things, really. The first thing is leaving a studio visit with a reading list, or having my head just want to explode from all the new ideas. And the second, and this is pretty base, but I'll admit it's true, is getting press, getting good press for something that we've done. So,
and how devastated are you by bad press?
I wouldn't know. We don't get bad press.
Fabulous. That's excellent. I mean, I think you really respect it. All right, here. How typical are you of New York galleries? How typical is your gallery of New York galleries and the attitudes you've conveyed here? I mean, obviously, you're really conscientious. You genuinely care about your artists and your relationship with them. You believe in their artwork. The priority is art over money. Can you say those things are true of Pace, Gagosian, Andrea Rosen, and the bluer chip guys?
Well, of the people that you mentioned, I would say that I think that's probably true of Andrea Rosen. I think Andrea Rosen is definitely in it for the art.
I know, I tried to throw in one like that.
I appreciate that. But there are other galleries who I think are even more powerful than Andrea Rosen, arguably Paula Cooper, et cetera, who are definitely in it for the art. Marion Goodman.
Well, Marion and Paula have been fabulous for decades.
Yeah, exactly. So how typical are we? I mean, again, we came out of this incubator of like-minded galleries in Williamsburg. I would say most of the Williamsburg galleries are exactly that way. Pierogi is certainly that way. Parker's Box is certainly that way. Memento, et cetera.
I think Joe's really wonderful, and how he manages to make, Joe Amron of Pierogi Gallery, and how he manages to make interesting art while working with so many artists, I find absolutely amazing.
Yeah, we've determined that Joe never sleeps. That's the only way he can.
Oh, that's not, he must not, but he looks rested. Do you realize that the galleries that you just named as being historically long-term conscientious were all women?
I have recognized that in the past, yeah. I mean, as I was mentioning them, I didn't think about it just now, but yes.
Do you have role models? Do you ever say, what would so-and-so do? Who should Ed follow?
I do, but they vary per situation. I have some mentors in the art world who I will call up when I have questions. And I'll tell you that one of the galleries that I really respect for their business acumen is Jenkins.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give them a call and ask them, how would you handle the situation? And they're always very kind. And then one of the dealers who I think is an absolute hero across the board in all these fields and would certainly look up to in just about any context is Ronald Feldman.
Ronnie's a good guy.
He's an amazing guy. Absolutely stunning.
My partner was from Hartsdale when I first opened my gallery in the early 70s, and he was interested in art because Ron, I always called him Ronnie, because Ron Feldman had a gallery in Hartsdale before he moved to Manhattan, and he had a nice dog. And my friend would stop in there when he was in middle school and high school to pet the dog. And, as a result of petting the dog, he, ended up having a strong interest in art and ended up being my partner and an art dealer. I think how people gain access to the art world can be certainly circuitous.
Well, maybe we should get a gallery dog, maybe. So.
Yeah, but you got to get a good one, or one that's docile, that likes being petted.
Exactly.
I think I'm going to unmute everybody here, and we can listen to the cacophony and see if anybody has any questions that they haven't texted me about. At this point, hear all the echo. And then somebody muted them.
I don't have a question, but I wanted to comment that I haven't seen Jimbo's work, who you're showing right now, since I went to school with him at the Art Institute. And thank you for showing him. I look forward to.
Hi, Mary. Let me stop you a second and mute everybody, and then unmute you and Ed, because I like your new dog, Mary. Hold on one second. I'm muting everybody, and Mary, you are now unmuted, and Ed will be momentarily. So go ahead, Mary.
Well, I just wanted to make the comment that to thank you for showing Jimbo Latchley's work, because I lost track of him. We went to art school together, and so now I've looked him up, and I'm going to friend him on Facebook. And thank you for showing him.
No, we love Jimbo. He's absolutely amazing.
He's such a poet, isn't he?
Yeah, it's so funny you should say that, because I wrote something about Jimbo's work long before I started working with him, and I said exactly that he's that type of artist who's a poet. He's been collaborating with a poet, Lydell Shaw, and they work together as a team under the pseudonym the Chadwicks. And the Chadwicks will have an exhibition here in the gallery later in the year. So,
Excellent.
But they're also going to have a piece at the Museum of Art and Design sometime in June. So I don't know if you're in New York or if you come to New York, but a really fabulous piece will be in that show too.
If I do, it should be on it. Thank you.
Where is your gallery, Ed?
Our gallery is on 27th Street between 11th and 12th Avenues in Chelsea.
Have you always been there since you moved to the island?
Well, we were a little further west, and most people would say, how can you go further west? We're virtually in Jersey as it is. But we had an opportunity about a year ago to move into the space we're in now.
How long, so wait, a year ago you moved into the space you're in?
Yeah, a little over a year ago.
How long is your lease?
Our current lease has 3 more years on it.
How many galleries that own their own space?
There was a big influx of galleries who moved from Soho into Chelsea who bought their spaces, and they bought up all the cheap spots. So every one of us who moved in the last 10 years probably doesn't own our space unless you had buckets full of cash. So I'd say in Chelsea at this point it's probably less than 15% actually own their space.
I wouldn't have been thought it was that high. That's interesting. I see that Katrin has a question. Katrin, go ahead and ask.
Yeah, I have 2 questions actually.
Fair enough.
When you look at new artists, when you do, say you like the work, is the amount of collectors they have an impact? Like, will you ask them, who collects your work, how often, or all of that, or does that not make a difference at all if you happen to really like the work?
I don't ask that, but I understand from talking to a lot of other artists, or a lot of artists, that I may be in the minority there. I see it as my role to bring collectors to an artist. I don't see it as the artist's role to bring collectors to me. And we've never once signed up an artist because of the collectors that they already had. And we've certainly never asked an artist who their collectors are. But I can see where if an artist has some collectors, it makes sense for them to bring those collectors to the gallery and let the gallery sell that work, let the gallery develop a relationship with those collectors, possibly sell other work that the gallery represents to those collectors, roping them in. I think that strengthens the bond between the collector, the artist, and the gallery, and that's always a good thing.
What price range, for unique works of art, what's the least expensive and most expensive, without going, like if one's 300,000, but, and everything else is 48. But, what's the range of low to high for unique art?
In our gallery, I think it ranges from $900 to probably $35,000.
We haven't talked enough about video. How the hell do you price video?
Oh, I had another question.
All right, sorry, I'll get back to mine. You go ahead, Katrin.
So the other question was, you mentioned earlier that you will keep an artist for a while, even if they don't cover, the costs for the show, for the time. Does that mean even if they don't have any sales at all, or like if they cover a certain percentage, say you really like them, but they somehow don't sell, what happens?
I keep working with them. It's not something I can do indefinitely, but if I really believe in the artist, I believe it is my job to find them as much of a market as I can find them. Now, I'll be honest, I think there are really important artists out there, including ones who are in the history books and even ones who are in the museums, who are never, ever going to have a market like Damien Hirst or Murakami or Jeff Koons. They just don't make that kind of work. But that doesn't mean that the galleries working with them can't place as much of their work as they can try to place. So it's not something you can do indefinitely. Obviously, Leo Castelli had to let people go, but it is definitely something that...
You sure stuck by Salvatore Piscoletto for a hell of a long time.
Yeah, and there's some artists that I work with that are not making a lot of money off what I can do for them either. So,
it happens. All right, let's go to the video thing. How many artists do you make that create video?
How many artists do we work with to show video? I'd say 40% of our artists work in video.
Is it, when you say work in video, is that their main medium or adjunct?
I'd say of the artists who, I'm looking at my artists now, if it's their main medium, it's 3, 4. 4 of my artists, it's their main medium out of the 18, and an additional 4 or 5 at least. Maybe it's not as many as 40%. Maybe it's more like 35%.
How do you price? How do you know how do you price video?
It's a series of things. It's how many channels the video is. It's what the edition size is. It's certainly what the market is for that artist's video. We worked with Eve Sussman, and her work sells for a lot more. We work with a couple from Kyrgyzstan named Gulnara Kazmalieva and Muratbek Jumaliyev, and they have been the Venice Biennial, they've had solo shows at the Arts Institute in Chicago, etc. So the resume, to a large degree, also sort of indicates what the pricing will be.
What's the range of edition sizes?
It ranges usually from 5 till about 8.
Never like 300.
Never. No, that's Blockbuster's business. That's Netflix's business.
All right, but how do you worry about copyright or people redistributing your videos?
No, because when we sell a video, there are certain safeguards in place for the collector. We give a signed copy of the medium that they're most likely to play it in, whether it be a DVD or a Mac Mini or a Blu-ray disc. We also give a certificate of authenticity, and the certificate of authenticity is the only way that you could resell that piece.
Yeah, but that's they'd like to share it with their 40 best friends, like one collector we met with who thought that was fine, and they could all swap the videos that they collect, and they wouldn't own them, but they would be able to watch them and exhibit them in their homes.
Well, that's
I wasn't fond of that.
So you can make high-quality Xeroxes of your Picasso painting and give that to your friends as well. It doesn't mean your friends have a Picasso. And
so you're okay with that to an extent?
Yeah, because I think the truth of the matter is that collector's only hurting themselves when they try to resell that work, if they ever need to. They will have no one but themselves to blame for the difficulty of doing that.
I sold videos maybe over 10 years ago, and some of them were sales to museums, and I encountered these institutions being worried about the longevity of the media, not how long it would last, but how long they would be able to reproduce it or, exhibit it, And sometimes people insisted on having the video on a hard drive, and that the hard drive they thought would be easier to store than a CD or a DVD, And I mean, if somebody had videos formerly on floppy disks or remember zip drives, and now you can't find a computer with a 5 1/4-inch floppy drive or a zip drive at all. Is this a concern about? I mean, do people express this as a concern?
Actually, that's the major concern with video at the moment. We had we launched a video art fair this year called Moving Image.
I wanted to get there. Thank you. I wanted to get to a discussion about that.
At Moving Image Art Fair, we had a panel discussion that included Chrissy Isles from the Whitney, Barbara London from MoMA, and Glenn Phillips from the Getty, all of whom are experts in video. And Chrissy Isles was very blunt. She said to all the dealers in the audience, she said, do not sell a DVD to your collectors. She is very much in the camp, and I agree with her, that what you need to sell is the file on a hard drive. Now, even files on hard drives have archival issues. If you don't play that hard drive at least once a year, it can start to sort of, I guess, digitally coagulate or corrupt.
Get dusty.
Yeah. So what we're seeing, which is really fascinating and highly ironic, is a lot of artists who've made video are having their videos transferred back to film, And the reason is that film has a estimated life of 200 to 300 years, and it is the only medium that we know that has that. So nothing.
That's interesting, because I bought a video by an artist for $9,000 who was a friend. And I play the video. It's on a hard drive. It's on a computer I bought with, it came with it. And I watched that video, or the video's running 24 hours a day, and I've had it like 7 years, and 3 or 4 years into it, the hard drive crashed. And I called up the artist and said, hey, here's another computer. Can you put it on there for me so I can continue to enjoy it?
Right.
And he said, sure. But if he's no longer living, it seems to me like the work of art that I might have spent $9,000, it might be worth $50,000 today, or in 5 years or something. All of a sudden, it might not even exist. It's a little scary. So the idea of film is interesting.
Well, yeah, and so your hard drive crashed or his hard drive crashed?
The computer, the hard drive, he sold me, the artwork was on a computer I bought from him.
Right.
And the hard drive crashed. And then I said, hey, I got extra computers, put it on this one for me. Because I didn't want to have the artist have to provide a new computer.
But the artist should still have a digibeta or some sort of method.
Oh, he certainly did. Sure.
And obviously, when he passes away, if he passes away, his estate should know how to take care of all that stuff. But
no, that's a good point.
It's all very tricky. This is where I think Chrissy was right. It's just, sell the collector a digital file on a hard drive, have that collector understand the importance of playing that disc, that hard drive, at least once a year. And that way, when it goes to the museum, your chances are better than not. It'll be okay. And all of the major video collections, like the Kramliks, et cetera, are currently remastering everything. And it's become a big issue.
A couple of comments where somebody commented about having a solid-state hard drive or putting the thing on a chip as opposed to a hard drive with moving parts. Comment?
I don't know quite enough about the hard drive technology. Leslie Thornton, who's an artist we work with who teaches at Brown, is as informed of the bleeding-edge technology as anybody I know, likes her work to be on a Mac Mini. And she is also one of the artists who is transferring her video to film. So she doesn't trust anything but film at this point, long-term wise.
But now I think, a 32 gigabyte mini, smart disk is, I don't know, only a handful of dollars. And I don't know. Do you know how big the files are on some of the videos that you sell?
They're approaching a terabyte.
Okay, so 32 gigabytes isn't going to cut it.
No.
At all. Okay. And how many channels is a terabyte usually? How many channels is that? Not more than one?
No, well, again, Leslie Thornton's files are, they're approaching a terabyte for a single video, but she's using, extreme high def.
Sounds like it. That's cool. I'll have to look more closely at that. All right, we may be ready to wrap this thing up shortly, but I'm going to unmute everybody here and see if anybody else would like to comment.
You don't have any comments?
All right, I'm muting everybody some more since I don't hear anybody. And Janet, fair warning, we're going to start you momentarily. And wait, I just saw Mary. Mary, I'm going to ask you if you have a question you want to ask. Mary, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I do have a question. Can you talk a little bit about the curatorial research lab? What exactly is that?
I'm sorry, I meant to ask that. That's good. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. I got to unmute Ed. That would be fair, wouldn't it? I'm sorry, Ed. Go right ahead.
Hi. The Curatorial Research Lab is a project space in our gallery, and it operates on a very simple premise. We give the space over to a curator and give them carte blanche to do whatever they like. We encourage, or actually I shouldn't even say we encourage, I give it over to artists who come to me with experimental ideas about curating. The more unconventional, the more unpolished, the more I like it. What it has produced in the past are exhibitions like the one called Used Books, where curator put up a work of art, and on a shelf under it were the books that the artists who had made the work were reading at the time. A show that we have up right now doesn't actually have any artwork in it. It has photographs of these objects that are really important to the artist, something that they think about a lot, something which has no artistic value whatsoever, but is important for them to have in their studio for whatever reasons. And so the idea is to let curators push the envelope, not worry about producing a polished show, mix it up, and use it like a laboratory.
Do those get reviewed as well?
They have. Actually, the current Curatorial Research Lab project got a nice little review on WNYC. And one of the ones we were the most proud of was actually a series of correspondence between Nem June Pike and John J. O'Connor, who was the television critic for television for the New York Times. And that show got some nice press too.
Let's take a moment before we wrap up. I want to know about your video fair and how you concocted this idea and how you got people to participate and how you figured out how to, oh, this is going to take more than a minute. And, you know, and how you felt about the experience.
We thought the experience was amazing. We're definitely planning on doing it next year. A lot of the galleries who participated said immediately that they were very interested in doing it again. My partner Murat and I had gone out to see the show at the Getty in 2008 called California Video, and it started a conversation about how you could show that much video and yet still let the viewer have an intimate experience with each individual piece and not have to have, you know, I guess something the size of Disneyland to show that much work in. It was also very much a conscious effort to show collectors that they could buy video and have it in their home and have it take up no more space than a painting or a small painting even. So it's a long-term conversation about something I think is really important to communicate, which is there are so many contemporary artists, whether their basic practice is sculpture or painting or photography, who are picking up video cameras, that if you feel your contemporary art collection is important, you can't ignore this medium. And for your collection to be important, you should probably consider supporting this medium.
Did you rent the video, the plasma screens that you used? I had a habit of going to Costco and buying them and then returning them after the show was over.
That's not an unusual habit.
No, okay. Fair enough. You know, a couple of people have commented, you have fans out here, Ed, you know, that you look 10 years younger. Maybe it's the power of the internet.
That's very sweet. Thank you.
And let's wrap this up with a last question. Do you have, I mean, you know, I think you're on a wonderful trajectory, and I like how collectors frequently talk about artists on a trajectory. Do you have difficulty remaining humble?
No, my partner Murat reminds me daily.
People can be useful. All right, I'm going to give everybody else one more opportunity to ask something, and then we'll be done. I think you've been really great. Anybody else want to fire up a question? All right, I'm muting all of you. And Ed, I think this has been really informative, and I think, you know, I think it demonstrates, you know, we didn't really address it, but it demonstrates the sympathy and the symbiotic nature of collectors and dealers. And we, you know, you alluded to it at the beginning, and we really didn't talk about it, but I don't know that we need to. About, you know, there's some artists think that dealers are antithetical to their interests or that they're competitive. And I think you demonstrate really clearly that we're all in the same pond and we're all swimming as fast as we can and we're all seeking to raise the level of the pond. And I think you do an exemplary job, and I'm pleased and flattered that you chose to participate with us. And I value you, and I will see you soon. So I'm going to unmute everybody so they can cheer or clap or whatever. But you've been really wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Ed.
Your gallery and meeting you in person.
All righty, Ed. You can stick around and listen to Janet so you know how to file your taxes, or, you know, I'm going to, all right. So everybody, thank you very much. And I am now stopping this recording.